Okay, welcome to linear algebra class. In today's class, we are going to talk about the applications of compressed sensing and the mathematics, and also followed by some MATLAB programming assignments. So what I want you to do is I want you to go to the applied linear algebra for engineers, the Canvas shell. Go to modules. Once you go to modules, you will go to fall 21 live lectures, and then there is this LA12. Today is the 12th class, so I want you to click on it, and that will download this zip file. So once you download that file, you can open that file, and then there will be this folder that I would encourage you to grab and drop onto the desktop. So then I want you to start MATLAB. So on your desktop, you should have this folder. In this folder, there is a subfolder called CVX. CVX is where the convex optimization files, the MATLAB scripts, are stored. So what I want you to do is go to MATLAB. So open MATLAB. So my online students, open MATLAB. And after MATLAB opens, what you want to do is you want to go back. What you want to do is you want to go back to the okay, now it's asking me to restart MATLAB for the license update. I will restart MATLAB, and hopefully this time it will be quick. Yep, that was quick. And then I want you to go to desktop and then click on LA22 codes, and then basically you can either add to path, or you can actually change the folder. And if you run at this time, you will realize that it's gonna give you an error. Oh, okay, it's running, good. So now you added, okay, good. So it's running, good. Then what I want you to do is I want you to go to CVX, and then you can actually add to the path. Go to CVX, and this is something very important. So I will take a minute to explain what this is. CVX is the directory in which all the convex optimization tools and the programs that we are going to use to solve today's sparse optimization problem are stored. But for that, what you need to do is you need to first and foremost click on CVS setup. So if you don't have CVS library installed, this will actually install the CVX library. Now, so it will automatically add. So open C function CVX setup. So everyone, please open CVX setup. And as you can see, when I ran that L812, it gave me an error saying unrecognized function or variable CVX begin. That is indicating that the CVX codes are not in the library. So CVX setup, my online students, were you able to open CVX setup? CVX, can my online student, okay, good. Now what I want you to do is I want you to run this file, and then it will actually install the files and in the directory, and then you should have successful installation of the CVX solvers. So CVX includes some solvers that are freeware, some solvers that are commercial. So when we run the CVX, as I have shown you, we will have access to all the free solvers, but we will not have access to the commercial solvers. You can use those if you pay the license or you buy the license. And in today's class, at the end of once you run this, you should be getting this prompt successfully installed. My online students, were you able to install? In-class students, were you able to install CVX? Okay. All right. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back and I'm going to start today's lesson. So, and as I start today's lesson, what I want to do is I want to ask this open-ended question before I begin. Is, as you can see, the linear algebra has some theory part, and the linear algebra has some hands-on application part. And I totally understand the theory part that I discuss, which comes from the textbook, is boring. But the hands-on part is where we actually get to play with the code. So my question to the class at this point is I want to make this class as exciting as I can. So do you want me to discuss the theory in detail, or you want me just to jump on to the examples? I don't mind jumping directly onto the examples, but the problem is this. Without sound understanding of background principles and theory, those examples would just be like, hey, this is cool. So unless you understand the math behind it, even though it is boring, even you may feel that, hey, this is something that doesn't make sense now. But once you start working with these types of systems or these types of equations, these types of methods in industry or in actual practice, at that time is this sound mathematical background would help you understand, or if you learn some new technique, then you will be able to make the connection between what we are learning and what we are actually doing. So just in general, what is the feeling of, I see online students, they are talking about the theory, but if the theory is boring, they can watch a movie on the side. It's not, it's not like in class students. So what do you guys think? Okay, so all right. Since, okay, now let me bring out my big stack of notes. Okay, so please bear with me as I cover some basic theory part, but I promise you this, At the end of discussion of theory, all this theory will make sense once we work out the problems. And today's topic is actually super duper practical and super duper important. So what are we trying to study in today's class? We are officially starting section 3 of the textbook, which is compressed sensing and sparse matrices. So we are starting section 3. And what I want to do is, I want to first talk about concept of compressed sensing. Compressed sensing. Believe it or not, compressed sensing has revolutionized MRIs, magnetic resonant imaging, especially infant MRIs. Because as you know, for MRI, the person needs to be still. And if you want to have a high resolution MRI, it takes a lot of time, which is actually dangerous because you are subjecting that human being to very high energy levels that may give some maybe some adverse reaction. Now it becomes super duper complicated when you have an infant, say a 2-month-old baby or 3-month-old baby, because first and foremost, babies don't stay still. Second of all, if you want to construct a reliable image for babies, the babies are moving, then you have to subject them to higher intensity force fields, and also the amount of time that it takes is very high. So for infants, doing MRI was a very, very risky procedure. But then over the last decade or so, with this advances in compressed sensing, you don't have to capture all the sets, all the images, all the resolution, all the points in the MRI. You can just capture few samples and still reconstruct the image as accurately as it could have been captured. And I promise you this, in today's class, I will show you the example where this compressed sensing works. Again, toy examples will work with the signal series, will work with the images, and so on and so forth. But before I go, actually talk about it, how many of you know what Nyquist theorem is? Remember Nyquist theorem? So this was the old paradigm. So basically what Nyquist, that is called Shannon-Nyquist sampling theorem. So imagine that if I have a signal and that signal is varying, if I want to reconstruct this signal reliably, then I need to have the sampling frequency twice the signal frequency. Why twice? So that I can capture all the peaks and valleys at least. And in actual practice, usually sampling is more than 10 times. So if your signal is at 1 hertz, your ADC or your sampling would be at 10 hertz. The problem with that is if you have a simple signal, that is all great. But if you have a complex signal, that becomes a lot of sampling. Now think about if you have an image, sampling is actually going to be a lot time consuming. Imagine you have a movie. Now the sampling is going to be even more intense. Imagine you're trying to capture an image, something like an MRI, where you have a lot of noise. To get rid of the noise and to construct the image recursively and reliably, your sampling requirements are going to be super high. And try to throw some filters in there. For the filters to work properly, they need to have enough samples so they can filter, right? If there is no flow, what would you filter? You see the argument? All right. So this compressed sensing is actually revolutionizing the way we look at the data, the way we look at the signals. Now, what that means is, here is the basic argument. So if you have something called as a compressible signal X, you have something called as a transform basis. So this is the signal. So this is the signal. This is the basis. And this is the sparse vector. So why do I call it sparse? Sparse means bunch of zeros. So there are bunch of zeros. If I choose an appropriate basis vector. Now, what do I mean by appropriate basis vector? So some classical examples of the basis vector are a wavelet basis or a Fourier basis. So if I choose a proper basis vector, then what I can do is I can transform this signal into something called as a very sparse vector. That means the vector with bunch of zeros. And when you have a vector with bunch of zeros, you can throw away the zeros, just retain the information, transmit that information, and use that data for reconstruction. Now, the wavelet basis and the Fourier basis we studied in last class. So what was the advantage of a Fourier basis? The advantage of Fourier basis was basically Fourier modes are perpendicular to each other. That is the classic way the compression is performed. That is the classic way the signal decomposition is performed. Now, what is the advantage of wavelet basis? If you have sharp transitions in the image, if you have contrast, then the Fourier basis may not capture that contrast, but wavelet basis will. So in the last class, we roughly, I gave you sort of an idea, like what you have is, you have an image. This image, even if it's a 1 megapixel image, think about it, you are dealing with 1 million pixels. That is a large data. So the idea is, and this is what we did in the last class, take this image, then basically find out the Fourier basis, and then you will notice that when you do two-dimensional FFT, most of the signal is concentrated over here. Here is bunch of noise or unimportant data. Then what you do is you basically zoom in on here. So what you have is basically you only capture this part from the Fourier transform, use the inverse Fourier transform, and recapture the old image. And believe it or not, this image A, this was the original image, and this is the image B, that is the reconstructed image. They will be very close to each other. So in the last class, we talked about why all this works. This only works because the image space is huge, which means even though we say that, hey, we have this image, and even though we say we have tons of data, most of that data is consisting of numbers which are close to zero or the numbers that are zero. So that is basically what we studied in last class. Now, this vastness of image space actually works out in our favor. So somehow, if I could find out a basis that would take this image and separate out the zeros from ones or zeros from the useful information, then essentially my compression, my data will be compressed significantly. So let me mathematically state the problem of compressed sensing. And this may look mathematical, but what I would do is I will try to give you a mathematical justification of it. So vastness of image space allows us to compress data. So what I'm going to do is I have a signal or a matrix X. I have a matrix C, that is the transformation matrix. Actually, let me rewrite this, so something like this. So Y is my output. Y is given as a matrix C times X. This X is either the signal or matrix. Now, what this means is X could be some pixel values. Multiply that by a matrix and I get Y, and Y is the image, the resulting image. But this X, if it X, this X can be represented as a basis multiplied by sparse vector. So this is the basis and this is the sparse vector. What I can do is I can try to find out some sort of minimum number of vectors or the least amount of data that would allow me to reconstruct my image. And that mathematically is represented as something like this. Determination of S is given as argmin of S given the norm of S subject to Y is equal to C psi S. Now, let me explain what this problem is dealing with. At the end of the day, to get Y, I need to process X. So X is maybe digital values. But that X, when I capture it initially, it's huge. What I want to do is, I want to split that X. So it's a decomposition problem. I want to decompose that X into a basis and to a sparse vector. At this point, this is super important. I can decide the basis. I can say it's a Fourier basis. I can say it's a wavelet basis, or I can say any other basis. The condition is orthogonality. So I want all the bases to be perpendicular. So if I know the basis, if I have captured X, how do I find out the most optimal S? And now, why is this condition of optimality is important? Because many a times the problem that we are going to solve will have lot more variables and less number of equations, or the problem that we could have is less number of unknowns and lot of equations. So essentially you are going to have to solve, and this is very important, you are going to have to solve either a least square problem or some other problem that gives you optimal solution. Now some of you may ask me, hey, we spent so much time talking about the least square solution. Why not just find the least square solution? Can someone tell me the biggest problem with least square? Huh? Directionality? No, that is okay. So I tell you the biggest problem with least square, and that's why the least square is not used in quite a few machine learning algorithms. Least square is very, very susceptible to noise. What that means is, if you have, and I will show you, I will run a MATLAB script and I'll show you an example. Imagine that you have a data set, you want to fit a line, but if you have some outlier, your least square will be thrown off. Even though that outlier is not really the part of the data set. But if you use, and imagine something like that, that if you have a lot of noise when you are capturing data, and that's precisely is the problem when you are acquiring MRI images. That's precisely the problem when you are getting data from sensors. The sensors data is going to be noisy. or sometimes the sensors send you abnormal data, out of bound, quantization errors. And if you get that data and try to use the least square, your values are going to be wrong. Many a times, what will least square try to do? Least square will try to find, this is very important, values for all the variables. Least square will try to find the values for all the variables. But believe it or not, sometimes those values could be perfectly fine zeros. So you really don't need those super duper accurate values. For practical purposes, those values can be zero. So that's why we have to come up with a different technique or different norm. What is the norm of the least square? 2 norm. So that 2 norm is notoriously susceptible to noise and outliers. So what we do is we use something called as L1 norm, which is called as the taxi cab norm, which means how would you go from point A to point B in a taxi? So you go in a straight line with, you'll find the absolute values. So taxi cab norm is used for a lot of machine learning algorithms. So the idea is, this is the problem that I want to set up. So I want to find out this sparse vector subjected to the condition y is equal to c c s. And how do we solve it? We cannot solve this problem by hand. For that, we use MATLAB codes. And those MATLAB codes are the algorithms, different algorithms that are developed by optimization researchers to solve the problem. And CVX is the compilation of those optimization algorithms. If you are really interested in optimization, there are classes that will just talk about optimization. Folks do PhDs in optimization. But in this class, what we are going to do is we are going to use those techniques. We are going to use those tools to solve practical data science problems. And please understand, at the end of the day, these are all matrices that deal with. So we will get to singular value decomposition. We'll talk to principal component analysis. Now, if you think about the techniques that we talked about a very rigid data. Many a times the data is not rigid, data is fluid, data is changing. So how do we construct robust singular value analysis? How do we construct robust principal component analysis and all that type of stuff? That is what is more important. So yeah. That again. C is called the measurement matrix. Yes, I will expand on that. So, okay, let me give you an example. Okay, the example is this. Imagine that you have a thermometer, a glass thermometer. Okay, that is your dynamical system. Glass thermometer is used to measure the temperature. What is the physical phenomenon that actually used to measure the temperature? Expansion of mercury in the glass tube. Expansion of mercury means change in the length of the mercury in the glass tube. That's what you see. Okay, so that what you're seeing is X. But that X length needs to be converted to some sort of temperature. So what do? You have some sort of a scale factor that will take that change in the length and convert that into temperature. So in that case, it is just a scalar value. Y is a number, C is a scalar, X is a number, X is the length that is changing. Do you agree with me? Now let's make it into 2 dimensions. Say you have a system and you want to measure the position and the velocity. So what will happen? That C will now become a matrix. Do you agree with me? So that is what the C is. Now go a step further. Now you have an image. So you got a matrix, but that image is color. So you have RGB. So it became a tensor now. So your C is actually going to become a tensor. So that is what is C all about. Yeah.
Can we go in this part like to separate out zeros, and when we can do a principal component analysis of X, then we can do the optimization.
So okay. So it's that separate out zeros and one part. It's not that simple. The reason for that is, here is what I want to, and actually let me point this out. We are trying to find out the S, and we are trying to allow S to contain a bunch of zeros. As long as this optimality condition is satisfied, the solution of S will perfectly good for all practical purposes. What is happening in principal component analysis? So the philosophy is slightly different. In principal component analysis, what you do is you can do SVD or whatever, you try to find out the principal components. And then you try to separate out signal and noise. But here, what I'm trying to do is, I'm trying to find out the sparse vector without doing any processing on the original data set. So, this could be a little confusing, but bear with me for a minute and I will actually show it to you with the MATLAB example. That will make these things super clear. Yeah.
So can you explain what argument is?
Argmin, yes, argmin is it's a norm. So let me, actually, you're right, I should give you the definition of that norm. That norm, I think I just explained it to you. That is called as the taxicab norm. K, and I will explain it to you. SK. Argmin is the minimum. So if your S is something like S1 plus S2 plus S3. So now let me give an example. You're at point 1 and you want to go to point 2. So there are different directions that you can take, right? So this distance, say this is S1, S2, S3, S4. So what you will do is you will actually add them together, and that will give you, this is the taxicab norm. Absolute value of S1 plus absolute value of S2, absolute value of S3, and absolute value of S4. Now what I want to do is, so here, okay, let me explain this again because I want to explain this in terms of. So what I have is, I want to go from point A to point B, and I have two paths. So I have S5 and S6. Now my question to you is, there are two, which path would you take? Would you go from S1 to S1, S2, S3, and S4, or would you go from S5 to S6? What you would do is, you would use argmin norm of S. What does that mean? It means you are going to take the absolute value of S. So even though you go up or even you go down, you basically treat that as a positive distance. So you would say S1 plus S2 plus S3 and so on. And you will compare that with S4, S5 and S6. And then you will say that, hey, the best path maybe is S5 plus S6, because if I were to draw a straight line between those 2 points, that is the path of shortest distance. So that this problem is stated in terms of that optimization problem. You may ask me, and actually it's good that you asked me this question. Please ask, if I write something, if you don't understand, stop me and ask question, because sometimes I may assume that some of these concepts are known, but they might be not. What is y is equal to c phi s? Now imagine there is a block here, there is a block here, there is a block here, there is a block here. So these are the constraints, right? So you cannot, your path cannot go through these objects. So given the constraint y is equal to c phi s, what is the best path to go from point A to point B? This is the optimization problem, and that is the mathematical description of that optimization problem. Everyone understood this?
Last question.
Yes. No, no, okay.
I forgot.
No, that's okay, that's okay. And since you got me started, now let me ask you, what is the physical interpretation? This is very important, of the constraint y is equal to c phi s. Yeah. Ask before you forget, ask that question.
So which one of these matrices are we going to use to process the sparse matrix important?
No, so yeah. So basically, so here's the first clause. Let me answer this first. And then that question is correct. So sometimes it might just be a good idea for us to S1 to be 0 and just follow maybe S5, S2, S3, and S4. That could be a perfectly possible solution. So that is the meaning of sparse. But I just want to tell you this. What is the meaning of y is equal to c phi s? S is the thing that we want to find out. You agree with me? Phi is telling me it's a basis. So it is saying something like you cannot go in circles. You just have to go vertical or horizontal. That is what is psi. That is telling me that is the condition that you have. Your basis, you need to go perpendicular to the previous basis, perpendicular to the previous basis, and so on. What is C? C is actually what you do. So what essentially, finally, once you have the path, but you have to walk on that path, right? So think about C is like telling you that even though you have path, now what you do is follow 3 steps along S, follow two steps along S2, follow 4 steps along S3, and so on. So finally, when you solve that optimization problem, you exactly know how to go from point A to point B, and that is the problem that we are trying to solve.
So is it similar to the traveling salesperson problem?
So traveling salesman problem is something different in a sense. You have incidence matrix and you solve it, but this again, that traveling salesman problem can also be written in terms of optimization problem. So, but this is what is the meaning of argmin.
A and B are two features, or
A and
do we consider A and B?
Oh, A and B are start point and end point. So basically, you are in say Poly, and you have to go to Tempe. So this is as simple as that. This is what the problem that you are trying to solve. You want to go from Poly, you want to go to Tempe. Okay. All right. Now, couple of important concepts. So measurement matrix C must be incoherent with the sparsifying basis, which means C should not have a direct correlation with psi. So that means the meaning of incoherent. And the reason that it needs to be incoherent is try to understand. Whenever you have coherence means correlation. Ideally, what you want to do is you want to get rid of all the correlation from the data. Correlation means what? How is A varying with B? So you don't want that. You want the information that is independent of each other. So basically, if you filter out and then find out that this is the filtered information where the information does not depend on any other information, that is the least amount of information that you can have for the reconstruction. That is the reason why C has to be incoherent with basis, and the number of measurements should be sufficiently large, and those are two important conditions for guaranteeing C times psi becomes a unitary matrix. And again, I'm not going to talk about, and I'm not an expert on the mathematics of compressed sensing, but that is the condition, which means as long as you capture all the information that is independent, all the crux of the information from the data, squeeze the data and find the information that does not depend on anything else. And as long as that information is sufficiently random, you should be able to reconstruct. Now, this is all there to it. Now, what I want to do is, I want to talk about the examples where this mathematical machinery is used. So I'm going to go to MATLAB. Let me see if there are any questions from my online students. Okay. So now I'm going to go to MATLAB, and I would strongly recommend that you switch to MATLAB as well. Can you see my MATLAB screen? Now, what we are going to do is, we are going to work out some super interesting examples. So jelly.jpg is the image that I have included in the base folder. And if you want to see that image, just click here, and that just highlight, and that image will be shown in the bottom screen. That is the image of the jellyfish, and it's pretty detailed image. Yeah, it's pretty detailed image. So what I'm going to do is, in the first section of the code, when I'm going to run it, I'm going to capture that image and convert that into an RGB image. So what you should do at this point is, you should run this section. Once you run this section, everybody got that black and white RGB image? Okay. And that image, if you were to see, you will notice that image has the dimension that is shown over here. Now, what we are going to do is, we are going to repeat the process what we did earlier. So basically, we are going to find the two-dimensional FFT. So we will run this second section. We will run two-dimensional FFT, and you will notice that that image, the information, the key information is located where the bright white spot is. Those are the FFT coefficients. Now what I'm going to do is, and this is something similar to what we did in last class, but I'm going to zero out all the small coefficients. So can you see that keep threshold is 0.5? So I'm just going to keep 5% of the data and then try to reconstruct the image. And you will be pleasantly surprised that all this becomes dark, and these are the coefficients that capture the essential information. Then if you go down, what you do is, when you run this section, you will get an image, and I want you for a minute to compare your original image with this compressed image. And if you think about it, you will notice that these two images are fairly close. Even though the image number 4 is basically constructed only from 5% of the data. Now, but what did we lose? There is significant computational time, computational resources that are utilized. To compute two-dimensional FFT, if you remember in the last class, MATLAB had to go row-wise, and then column-wise, column-wise and row-wise, either way is fine. and then perform these computations to find that picture for plot number 2. But what we are going to do now, and I'll show it to you in the next example, rather than capturing the image in FFT, I'm going to randomly sample the image and grab those pixels. As long as those randomly grabbed pixels are sufficiently random, then I can still recapture the exact image. So I will show you in just a minute that so here the next part, and why this is all important. This is all important, and this is just the data visualization. If you were to look at the way data is in 3 dimensions, you will notice on the left hand side you have the image, on the right hand side you have the 3-dimensional representation of data, and those peaks are essentially the information that you really want to keep. So if I were to scan this in such a way that randomly I can scan these points, and I'm going to go and just scan randomly these points, then I should be able to capture my image very well. So let's go to a few more examples, and then we will actually work out the problem. And I just want to tell you before we actually use the compressed sensing, this is an example where I'm trying to solve the problem y is equal to theta times s. So basically y is equal to theta times s using the 2 norms that I talked about. L2 norm is the least square and L1 norm is the least distance. So what you need to do is, and please understand that this system of equations is actually huge. So this system of equation is fairly huge because see, n is very high, p is also very high. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to construct this random matrix. And why is this important? Because when we start sampling, we get data, but that data is not sufficient. From that data, we need to construct the sparse vector. So sparse vector construction will be done using the L1 norm, but I just want to show you this. Let me run this example. So, and what you will notice is these 2 solutions. So you have a solution S underscore L1, and you have the solution S underscore L2, and I want you to get those solutions. So S underscore L1. Can you see that this is the L1 solution? And can you see that there are a bunch of zeros? So this is the sparse solution that we obtained. And now S underscore L2, this is the solution that we obtained from the least square. What would you expect from the least square solution? Least square solution will not be sparse. Least square solution will have bunch of numbers. Can you see that least square solution has bunch of numbers?
Is it because of noise?
That is because of the noise. So, but now some of you may ask me, okay, that's fine, but which solution is good? To me, as long as my left hand side of the equation is equal to right hand side of the equation, that is my solution. So whether I use S underscore L1 or if I use an equation or a solution S underscore L2, that is totally fine because that solves the problem I'm trying to solve. Now, next thing is what I want you to do is, and this is actually where you will see what happens. So that shows you the sparsity of the solution. So basically you will see on the left hand side, you are finding the solution using the L1 norm, and on the right hand side, you are finding the solution using the L2 norm. L2 norm gives you some sort of Gaussian histogram, but L1 norm gives you peak, which means it shows you that the solution is sparse. So now this is where you will actually see the power of compressed sensing. So let me quickly tell you what we did earlier. We had a system of equations and we tried to find out approximate solution using L1 norm and L2 norm. What was the difference? L1 norm and L2 norm, the answers that we got still satisfied left hand side is equal to right hand side. But the solution that we obtained from L1 norm has a lot of zeros compared to the L2 norm. L2 norm gave us a bunch of non-zero values. Okay. In other words, L1 norm helped me obtain the sparse solution, the solution that has a bunch of zeros. Now, this is the problem that I'm trying to solve. I have an audio signal. This is a constructed audio signal. And what I'm going to do is, I'm going to randomly sample the audio signal. I'm going to randomly sample the audio signal, construct the sparse solution, and use that solution to reconstruct the original signal. Believe it or not, what is happening? You have a random signal with bunch very dense data. I'm going to randomly sample that bunch of complex signal. So I'm going to violate the Nyquist criteria. But then the data set that I get from there, I'm going to construct a sparse solution. And from the sparse solution, I'm going to reconstruct the complex signal. Everyone understood this? This is actually the compressed sensing mathematical machinery in action. So this is very important. So you should, okay, let me go ahead. So first, I'm gonna run this section that actually constructs the signal. Then I'm gonna randomly sample the signal. Please note that basically this sampling is random. And once I do the random sampling, I get this compressed measurement. Then what I'm gonna do is, I'm gonna solve the compressed sensing problem. And how am I gonna solve this compressed sensing problem? I'm gonna solve this compressed sensing problem using the L1 norm that we just showed. Everyone understood this? So run this. It will do all this simulation, and probably you're thinking, hey, what actually happened here? And now prepare to be amazed. What this plot is telling you. I had the initial complicated signal shown in black. What I did, those red points are the points that I captured. Okay. But what I did, from those red points, I actually used that data to compute the sparse solution and transformed it using the basis, and voila, I got the original signal that I did not sample. This is compressed sensing.
So can you correlate the role of constraint in this application?
Constraint?
Yeah, the role of constraint in this application.
So it's not a, it's a condition that it needs to be sufficiently random. The the sampling has to be sufficiently random. So, and to be honest with you, there is, I want you to take a look at the code for a second with me. So you will see exactly what is going on. The first part of the code, it's just you are constructing the signal. Once you constructed a signal, you did the FFT to see what are the important frequencies in that signal. Then what you did random sampling. And please note, so you only captured 128 sample, even though you had sample of 4096, that is the N. You only captured or sampled 128 samples, but those samples were sort of random. And then what you did, you actually constructed a vector, which was the compressed measurement. And then you formulated or you used the basis and found out the L1 solution. So this is actually L1 minimization problem. And then what you did is you actually reconstructed the original signal. So that exactly what happened here. So when you look at the plot, essentially what you are doing is, even though this signal is super duper complex, you are taking the snapshots over here, 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 here. Then using these snapshots, you are finding the sparse solution and transforming that sparse solution with your basis, and you got your original signal. And it looks pretty close to me. Yeah.
How do we actually generate the sparse solution?
How do we compute?
Generate it.
So basically, for that, we don't generate it. We use the CVX toolbox. So here,
How
if
does
you
it work?
so norm S1, minimize norm S1 subject to the condition delta times S is equal to Y is, remember that argmin problem that I stated. This is the CVX syntax to solve that argmin problem. So basically, we solved that problem and we computed the value of S. S is the sparse solution that we want, and then we transform it back.
That means both the matrices come together, or basis is generated on the basis.
Basis is select. So basically, you want to come up with, you need to get an orthonormal basis. The basis is something that you have, but what you want to do is using that basis. So finally, what do I mean by basis? Basis means nothing but a matrix. As long as it comprises of normal columns, so column space is perpendicular to each other. And in the case of Fourier basis, the column space is orthonormal. Wavelet basis, column space is just normal. So basis is given. Okay, and this will be actually, I will make this, I'll spend some more time on this. Okay, this is the crux of compressed sensing, and that's why I actually wrote it here explicitly. A given signal, if it is sufficiently sparse in a known basis, if a signal is sufficiently sparse in a known basis, may be recovered with high probability using significantly fewer measurements than the signal length if there are sufficiently many measurements and these measurements are sufficiently random. So now let me give you the second example. Okay, so this is the data set. So run section, this will load the data set, and this will actually show you how it works. So just wait a second, and I need to actually arrange this so that you will understand. So what I'm trying to show you here is I'm trying to show you the decomposition So what I want to show you is I need to arrange this in a particular fashion so that the picture will be clear. So just bear with me for a second. And so basically, I have this image, this data. Okay, just a second. And my online students may not be able to see me, what I'm doing, but what I want you to see here is you're randomly sampling in figure 2, and basically the compress sensing problem, I want you to think about this problem like this. You have a data which is cc.mat. It has lot of data points. So what I'm doing is I'm using the data set to find psi. I'm finding this C, and then I'm actually plotting the values of theta, which is C times psi. And once I find C times psi, I solve for the compressed sensing problem and actually find out S and Y's. So that is what is happening. So this is actually the geometric or pictorial representation of the process that I just went through with the signal that I showed you. So, and next part is depending upon what type of random sampling that you use. So, so the idea is that you have data and you are randomly sampling. But what type of random? Is it Bernoulli random? Is it a Gaussian random? So there are different types of randomness. And again, there are conditions on that, like how random you should be and which random sampling gives you better results. So if you spend some time with this code, and I would encourage you to take a look at it, you will see that depending upon different types of random sampling techniques, your solution are different. And then what I want to show you is something like this. And this is an example that I kind of talked about a little bit. So this is the power of L1 norm. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to do a line fit, and my data is shown by those circles. Can you see that data that is in circles it actually follows a fairly straight line? But if I were to do an L2 norm solution, if I were to find the least square fit, that red line is the solution. But that is not the actual representation of the trend. But if I were to use the L1 norm, you can see even though there is noise, even though there is variability, even though there are outliers, I can still get a reasonably good solution. That is why L1 norm is preferred in machine learning approaches. So that is what is happening over here. So this is just an example. And the last part is basically it talks about the randomness in the equation. So now here is the basic problem. All of us are very familiar with L2 norm, and L2 norm may work in a lot of applications. But the L2 norm or the least square solution will not give us good results when we have variability, when we have randomness, or when we have outliers. In that particular case, L1 norm gives us good result. So what should I do to get sort of the best of both worlds. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to say, I'm going to find a solution that is going to work with L1 and L2 norm. So the optimality condition is something called as, you are going to have L2 norm plus some sort of constant times L1 norm. And the solution, so we looked at the solution just found from L1, we looked at the solution just found from L2, and both these solutions, they have their domain of applicability. Sometimes L1 is better, sometimes L2 is better. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to use a technique which is called LASSO, L-A-S-S-O. In that setting, it will find the solution combining these two norms. So sometimes you will hear what is LASSO. LASSO is a short form for the technique. Essentially, what it does, it combines the L2 norm, it combines L1 norm and finds the solution. So in this problem, I want to tell you why this problem is important, because even though the equation that we are trying to solve is B is equal to A times X. So we are trying to solve the solution. So B is equal to A times X. So this is the classic problem that we are going to solve. B is given, A is given, and we want to find X. Now the problem is that this A has a lot of noise. And what happens when A is noisy? I want you to understand this very important thing. The algorithms that we talked about, the least square, for that matter, inverse, assumes that this matrix A is well conditioned. What do I mean by well conditioned? If A is a square matrix, the ratio of eigenvalues is less than 10. So if you find the eigenvalues of A for inverse, for numerical stability, the ratio of maximum eigenvalue to the minimum eigenvalue should be less than 10. Only then you will get a solution numerically stable. You can numerically solve that problem, or you'll get a solution that is meaningful. In the case of rectangular matrices, the ratio of singular values should be less than 10. Only then you can solve the least square problem, or you can do SVD and all that type of stuff. But with LASSO, when you are combining both these, you should be able to get a good solution. And this is what is shown over here. So what I would encourage you to do is look at the solution, and this actually shows you the mean square error, and it will show you that the LASSO gives me the least error compared to just the L1 solution or compared to the L2 solution. So LASSO is used a lot in signal processing and data science, because in data science problems, we are going to solve this equation AX plus B is equal to B. A is super noisy, B is noisy or sparse, and finding out X when A is super large or super noisy is not easy. That's why you are going to use some sort of solution, and the least square norm is not going to give you, it's not going to be the best norm. So we combine least square norms and the taxicab norm and find the solution. That algorithm is called LASSO. So with this, I'm gonna stop here, and I will be happy to answer any questions that you may have. So I will stop recording.